Well, tróna má a háde and is Spanish mé leis an Tionscadal Turas in Ervine Belfast. So I am the manager of the Turas project in East Belfast. It's an Irish language project, part of the work of East Belfast Mission, who are a Methodist church. They've been based on the Newtonards Road for almost 200 years. So I was going to talk a little bit about the Turas project and about the work that we do there. So Turas, if you don't have any Irish, means journey. And I suppose for us, what started off as a journey into a language has turned out to be a journey of healing and a journey of reconciliation. And that all ties into the complications around identity in Northern Ireland. Turas came about very accidentally. There was no plan, there was no big idea. I basically lived on the Newtonards Road, and I was part of the East Belfast Mission congregation. I was part of a cross-community women's group that met there. One week we met in East Belfast Mission, and the next week we met in Shortstrand Community Centre, just an ordinary women's group, and we got up to all sorts of exciting things. We wrote poems and wrote stories. And then we were told that we were going to do a 6-week taster in what was Ulster Scots, Irish language. And I remember thinking, yeah, that would be interesting. Now, I hadn't even studied a language at school, so I had no experience with language. And I found right away that I wasn't a very good language learner. But hitch me and Raleigh and Changa, I fell in love with the language. And I don't know what it was that attracted me to it. Something about when they told me that, to say I speak Irish, you don't tend to say Lorm Gaelic. You tend to say to Gaelic Uggam, I have Irish. And I remember thinking, I'd love to be able to say to Gaelic Uggam. I'd love to be able to say that that's part of who I am, that's part of my identity. So I decided then I would start to learn it. Now, I had no great aspirations. I just wanted to learn a couple of focal. And I couldn't do that in East Belfast because that 6-week project was gone. But I was told that there was classes over in Andrehead on the Armour Road. So I asked my friend to go. Now, she was a wee bit her daddy was a UDA manager in the 70s, and she don't know what that's all about. But anyway, I persuaded her, and away we went. And people were so friendly, it was very welcoming. Though I have to say, now she blames me and I blame her, because we thought that we were the first Protestants to ever learn Irish. We thought we were real trailblazers. And I think we must have made it very obvious on the day that we were prods. So the girl that was taking the class, Anya Myra, who was a wonderful teacher, during the lunchtime, I think to make us feel at ease, she said, there's all sorts of people come here. In fact, we have a man from East Belfast, and you'll never believe this. He is a member of the Progressive Unionist Party. I said, Anya Myra, my husband is the leader of the Progressive Unionist Party. And basically that's how it started. A journalist got the hold of the story that I was going to these classes, and it ended up in a couple of newspapers. And I mentioned East Belfast Mission. They were then approached by members of their own staff, people who lived locally, who said, here, we want to go to this class. And there was no class. It had been a 6-week taster. So we started a class. And for the first year, we just did it as a voluntary thing. And then I started, I think it was providence rather than coincidence, but a series of things happened, and I ended up speaking to Forest na Gaelica, who are a cross-border Irish language funder, and they said they would give us the money to run a project for 1 year. So I left my job. I was a teacher, I was an English teacher in East Belfast, and I left my job. I got a career break. I couldn't have done it, so I had the safety of this year out to go and do this, and I hadn't a clue. I hadn't a notion what I was doing at all. But it just turned out to be really successful, and loads of people came. The first year, I think maybe there was 60. This year, and we've just been going just over 10 years, almost 500 people have signed up for classes. So we are one of the biggest Irish language providers in Belfast now. We would run about 17 classes a week, all levels, all abilities, and I think the lovely thing about it is very cross-community. What started off probably 99% Protestant over the years has changed. I think the last time we looked, probably about 60% from the Unionist community, about 26, 27% from the Niceness community, and the rest are others that we can spot them a mile off, you know what I mean? They are. Don't hide behind that other, we know what you are. That's a joke, by the way. Real friendships are created. That's the lovely thing. We don't have to do 10 Catholics, 10 Protestants. Let's sit down and talk about how different we are from each other. People just come together because we love the language. We have even had 2 marriages and a baby. I do a bit of matchmaking on the side. I only talk about the successes, not the failures. Now we have people at university as well. Over the years, people went from Bunrang, total beginners, and have progressed and progressed. So 9 people now at university doing degrees and doing diplomas, and myself, I'm in the last year of my degree doing Irish, and as somebody who's not a good language learner, but who just struggles on, that would be my advice to any of you who are learning Irish or thinking of learning Irish. Just keep doing it, and it comes. We have a wonderful Lowerland. There you are, Brian, you see yourself in there? We have a lovely Lowerland, a library area, and this came about, we got a little bit of funding, we were able to create a little social space, because for the first probably 6 years we didn't even have access to water. We had no kitchen area or anything like that, so now we have that. And because our learners were starting to get more involved in serious study, we have our own GCSE class, people go out to do A-level, and as I say, a diploma, and the degree at Queen's University and Ulster University. We wanted to be able to give them somewhere to study. We'd also, the Lowerland came about because we had got some books, and we got a second-hand bookshelf, and we kept the books on it, and people gave us books, and we bought books, and people borrowed the books, and they didn't bring them back, and that was fine. And then the books grew, and then we got another second-hand bookshelf. So eventually we were running out of room, they were all over the floor. So we got the wonderful Lowerland, which Brian here set up for us, which was fantastic, and we got a proper library lending system, and it's become really, really popular. And the wonderful thing about it is it's not just for the use of our learners, it's a public lending library that anybody can come and borrow books in. The majority of the books are in Irish, some of them are in Scots Gaelic, some of them are in Manx Gaelic, some of them are in Ulster Scots, some of them are in Scots, and the ones in English would be about Irish language subjects and history and geography. So it's just a wonderful, wonderful resource for our learners. We have a group of Cairde, a music group, and that Chevy shouldn't be there. Yeah. Oh, my bad grammar is exposing itself. Apologies for any Irish speakers there, should be no Chevy. But we have a group of Cairde, we have a beautiful music group. They won't call themselves a choir because they don't think they sing well enough, but I can tell you they sing absolutely beautifully. We also, as part of our journey and our whole kind of thinking around identity and challenging, I suppose, what was all around us, challenging the status quo, challenging where somebody wants to shove you in a box and tell you that because you're this or you come from that background, this is how you should think, and this is what you should do, and this is what you should or you shouldn't be allowed to learn. You know, we're not going to play that game. We're not getting involved in that. So one of the things that came about, my colleague, Dr. Gordon McCoy, he had done a lot of research into the history, the Gaelic history of East Belfast, and because of our more recent history, both nobody was really interested in the Gaelic history of East Belfast except Gordon. And Gordon walked in and he brought all this wonderful 20 years of research with him. Now, Gordon is an academic and he loves a good lecture. I'm a more simple soul, so I turned it into bus tours. And we now have 2 fantastic bus tours and a new one just will be launching shortly. So one is the Con O'Neill bus tour, which is a storytelling bus tour which takes you to certain places in East Belfast associated with Con O'Neill's life. And the other one is the Gaelic history bus tour of East Belfast, which takes you through all different periods of East Belfast history. The Con O'Neill one will be going out on the 25th of February. Our new website, Journey East. So journeyeast.uk, if you want to book a ticket, there you go. You heard it here first, there's some seats left. So that has been very successful because for local people, it has awakened them to the history that has always been all around them, that is not a threat to anybody. It exists, it's there, and it's very important. And, you know, for me it's very sad. It's a bit like the place names. When I started learning Irish, I had no knowledge of my own environment. You know, I was born in Belfast, I've lived my whole life in Belfast. Nobody ever told me it was Belfast. Nobody ever allowed me to know that. And I think, how sad is that when you don't even have knowledge of your own place? So, you know, we don't want to push any agenda on anybody. We're not pushing any political, you know, ideology on anybody. But we're saying this is here and it belongs to all of us. A few years ago, we started to become more and more aware of the benefits of bilingualism. I got the opportunity to visit Gaelic-speaking schools in Scotland and in the Isle of Man, and obviously here in Northern Ireland. And as an ex-English teacher, I was very aware of the problems of the kind of low educational attainment and the high unemployment in East Belfast, and the literacy problems, where, you know, if you have another language, your literacy will be better in your first language. So this really interested me, and I saw the good work that was happening in various nationalist areas with Irish medium schools, with immersive education. And over the years, you know, we'd be talking about it, and sometimes parents who were involved with us, we'd run a family class for many years, they were interested in it, but we didn't know how to make it happen. And then back in 2018, we decided, well, you know what, we'll set up our own Irish medium nursery school. So we launched it in 2020 and didn't have a good start. We were intimidated out of the first place we were in. The second place became frightened. Then we got somewhere else. Now we're somewhere else. But it has grown, and despite all the problems, despite all the challenges, parents have come, and it's been turning out to be very, very popular. In the last 3 years, we've had over 113 expressions of interest, and we are nearly at capacity. We're hoping soon to get a place of our own, because parents from the Unionist community do want these things. They are interested. They want to be part of the Irish language community, and why shouldn't they be? We sell our own range of merchandise. It's a way of bringing in money, but it's also a way of raising awareness of the language. It's kind of a nice soft way of doing that. I suppose when we started, we were very, very controversial, but over the years that has changed. We've won all sorts of awards, and I'm very, very proud of that. I was always looking for ways to engage people with the language, and sometimes you can do that with a lecture or, you know, a bus tour or whatever. But I wrote a little comedy sketch. I called it What the Fockle, and about a woman who is married. Her loyalist husband takes great exception to her learning Irish, and he gets very excited. He says, "I'll not be speaking any language Jerry Adams speaks." She says, "Well, I think he speaks English most of the time." What's interesting is, though, Jimmy, the protagonist, he has to make his own journey with the language, and like many people from the Unionist community, he has a hostility towards the language and misunderstanding about what the language is about. But he starts on his journey, and by the end of the little sketch, he's in a different place. That's what I have seen in the last 10 years. I've seen people on a journey, and I've watched them making their way across, going through, struggling with, am I doing something wrong? Has this got something to do with me? Is this connected to me? And then they start to embrace the language. And I think it's very, very important that we leave space for them to be able to do that. I'm going to run through these quickly because I just want to, we're running a wee bit out of time. Okay. We have had loads and loads of really good publicity over the years and had lots and lots of fantastic coverage. Not everybody likes us, unfortunately, and this is probably one of the most public criticisms we ever had. And it was still quite early days. This was back in 2013. We started in 2012. And I got a phone call from a journalist one Saturday night to say that this man, leader of the Orange Order, had been up at Tweedale, and he had said Protestants shouldn't be learning Irish and they shouldn't be getting funded for it, down with this sort of thing. And what did I feel about that? And I said I was very surprised, because I'd had a very positive conversation with the Orange Order the week beforehand, and that certainly hadn't been the attitude. But, you know, when this man was claiming to speak for the Orange Order, I knew he was speaking for himself. But I was also worried about our learners, because at that time we were still quite small, and a lot of them, the Protestant ones, were still very frightened. They didn't like people knowing they were learning Irish. They worried sometimes about neighbours knowing, or friends knowing, or even relatives knowing. If cameras or if somebody took photographs, they walked out of the room. They didn't want to be seen. So I thought, well, when they hear this, they might just all scurry off. And Turas only exists because they're there. So I did a few interviews over the weekend and went into the papers on the Monday. And I went into work on the Monday morning. And I got a lot of phone calls. I got emails from all over the world, from people, Protestant people from here, who said, this is important work and you must keep doing it. But what was more really reassuring was my own learners, someone even maybe hadn't seen them for a few weeks, who turned up and said, this is important to us and we want to support you, and we're not going to be told, and we're not going to be intimidated, because this belongs to us too. And they started Cairde Turas, and Carmel's here tonight, she representing Cairde Turas, Friends of Turas, and they have supported me in my work over the last lot of years, doing a lot of the making the tea, welcoming the learners, speaking at events, all sorts of things, doing wonderful research. And for me, it's been a massive, massive help on a personal level, because especially in the early days, it was a very, very lonely place to be at times. And, I did have a target painted on my back, unfortunately. And they stand with me and will continue to stand with me. And with the trouble with the knee skull that we've had, they stand with me. So for me, I suppose the message that I want to say tonight is identity is a fluid thing, and to tell somebody or to try and impose an identity on somebody, I just think is so wrong, so not fitting, because what is our identity? Who can we say we are? And I examine my own background, and I can only go back a few generations, but on one side of my family, my grandfather was English, a man from London. My grandmother was Church of Ireland, obviously Ulster Scots background. On the other side, my grandfather was a Presbyterian with a very Irish name, and my grandmother was a Catholic from Clifton Street. So what does that make me? What does that make any of us? Because we're all that mixed bag, and why shouldn't we enjoy the gifts that Northern Ireland has to offer us, whether that's Scots or Irish or whatever? Thank you.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project that I was involved in with Cairde Turas, which looked at Irish-speaking soldiers in East Belfast who'd fought in World War I. This had grown out of an earlier small piece of work that Turas themselves had carried out, looking at Irish speakers in the census of 1901 and 1911, and subsequently it was discovered that some of them had actually been soldiers during the war. So that prompted Cairde Turas then to seek funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund to undertake a bigger piece of work looking at all of East Belfast, or all of inner East Belfast. We got that funding, and a group came together in 2019 to undertake the work. Now, we weren't professional historians. We weren't historians at all, in fact, but some of us did have experience of historical research, and we had other skills that we brought to bear. We were very keen to simply just kind of shine a light on this issue, which hadn't been looked at really at all before, and to just try and, kick up a little bit of dust around the issue, see what the historical documents said. We didn't have an agenda. We weren't trying to prove a point or anything. We just said, let's have a look. Let's see what history tells us about this topic. The area that we looked at, am I right? Oh, sorry, that should have been where it was. Here we go. The area that we looked at, if you know Belfast, is the area broadly between the Hollywood Arches and the Albert Bridge, and between Park Avenue, isn't it? And Ardnley Avenue. So that's more or less inner East Belfast. And those of you with really keen eyesight will see that the Conswater Shopping Centre is on this map, which lets you know it's not an old map, but it's just to give you a bit of an idea. That's more or less inner East Belfast. And our first step in the research was to examine the census, the online census of 1911. and to see what that would tell us about the area at that time. What we discovered was a number of things. Firstly, a lot of the area was still quite new. Some of the streets were less than 10 years old. So it was an area that was very much being physically constructed, and the communities that were living there, many of them were people who were still moving into the area or had just been there a small number of years. It wasn't a very long established community. Parts of it, now some of it was older, but large parts of it were quite new. It was also an area that was enjoying huge employment from the shipyards, the factories, the linen industries and so on. And so people had moved into the area from all over the country. And in 1911, every single county in Ireland was represented in that area. And so it wasn't a long settled, long established area. It was an area where there was a lot of movement into, quite new in some parts. It was also quite mixed religiously. There was at least about 25% of the population were Catholic, and they were they were dispersed right throughout the area. They weren't kind of concentrated in certain streets. So quite mixed in terms of religion, and there was quite a bit of Irish in the area at that time. That was really for three reasons, I suppose, or three main reasons why that was the case. Firstly, as I said, people had moved into the area attracted by employment, and some of them had come from parts of the country where the language was still strong, so they would have brought that with them. Also, Irish was being taught in the Catholic primary schools at the time, so any of the younger children who were attending those schools would have been learning Irish. And probably most significantly, Conradh na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League, was really active in East Belfast in that period and had been for some years. And that, in fact, is where the Gaelic League established itself when it moved to Belfast. It was providing language classes for adults, and it was really well not just supported but promoted by prominent unionists, by prominent Protestant clergymen, and even, I understand, the Grand Master of the Orange Lodge had a role to play. So it would look like at that point in time the language was supported by all sections of the community, and it wasn't an element in the construction of identity at that point in time. If you knew that somebody was an Irish speaker, or if you knew they supported Irish, you couldn't assume anything else about them. You couldn't assume their religion, you couldn't assume their politics. So we went on then to look at to try and identify our Irish-speaking soldiers. And the first thing we did was trawl the census again to look for Irish-speaking males within the age range that would have made them eligible to participate in the war, with a little bit of leeway at either end, because we knew people lied about their age to enlist too young or too old. We turned up a very substantial number of names, like several hundreds, and we then cross-tabbed that list of who we knew were Irish speakers with the Great War database, which is a database of East Belfast soldiers that was compiled by Jason Burke. Some of you may know Jason Burke from his work on history of that period. With a lot of double-checking and cross-checking, we eventually ended up with 74 names, and that became then the focus of our research. So what we did next then was to move away from the digitised information on the census and actually download the original census forms, which each family would have filled in on census night. And when we did that, and that's an example of the, you probably have seen these census forms. When we did that, we discovered, well, we didn't discover it because we knew we were going to find this, but we were surprised at the scale, the extent to which Protestant households who said they were Irish speakers in the census had their answers crossed out. And so this happened to a huge amount of the time. So obviously we set about trying to find out what's all that about. So we asked everybody we could, including the National Archives in Dublin and anybody else that we thought would know what was going on. Nobody seemed to know for sure. There were suggestions, but nobody had any real evidence. The most common suggestion that we came across was that people thought they were speaking Irish because they were on the island of Ireland. But that just didn't seem to make any sense at all. And the example I have up there, I don't know if you can see it, you can see that this family said they spoke broken Irish, which suggested they were trying to be very, very honest, but they had that crossed out, they weren't counted. Others would have said they spoke Irish and English, and that was just crossed out. Anyway, and other suggestions as to why this happened are interesting, because they seem to want to rely on constructing a role for Irish in the construction of identity that it didn't seem to have. So they want to read back retrospectively, sort of contemporary thinking, to what was going on over 100 years ago. So you get suggestions such as it was a political, it was a sort of an attempt by officialdom to reduce the number of Irish speakers amongst Protestants because they didn't want that to be a known factor. or that it was a protest by Protestant people themselves in an attempt to devalue the data on the Irish language question by sort of just filling it with rubbish. But I think those kind of theories are interesting because they do suggest that people are trying to read backwards and give a role to the language as an indicator of identity that it really didn't seem to have at the time. But anyway, we still had to decide, well, what do we do with this? We still have these crossed outs. And so we took the view that, well, these are historical documents. These people said they spoke Irish. Nobody knows why their answers were invalidated in this way, so we're going to count them. But we're going to focus our research on the ones that weren't crossed out or that seemed, that absolutely shouldn't have been crossed out. And so that's what we did. And so I'm going to take you on a quick tour of the research. I could literally speak for about 2 hours on this, but I haven't got 2 hours. So I hope what I say it makes some kind of sense, given that I'm just kind of going to rush through it and tell you a few things about our soldiers. Firstly, we were looking at a very small area, of course, and so not surprisingly, we found that we had, neighbours, workmates, friends, and family members who had all signed up. And this is the Wright family. There was 8 sons in the Wright family. I should say as well that, and some of you may notice, when you're doing this kind of research on soldiers in the First World War, only about 1/3 of the records remain. So most of what you want to know is actually lost to us. So it's really hard, and everything you do then is very, very kind of partial and patchy. So we know for sure that 4 of the 8 sons in this family signed up, and we know that because we have a photo of the 4 of them, and there's information on all 4. Because of if all 4 went in the family home on census night, so we don't know for sure that all 4 were Irish speakers, but we do know that the guy closest to me, whose name was George Wright, he was an Irish speaker, and it's quite likely his brothers were too, but we don't know that for sure. He served, I can tell you where it is. He served during the war. He was with the Royal Irish Rifles, and he survived the war. He was one of the lucky ones. We also had a lot of neighbours, and this is an attestation form which was, filled in by a person when they went to enlist. There was a street in Belfast at the time called Khartoum Street. It doesn't exist anymore. It was a tiny street. There was only about 16 families living on it. 13 men went to war off that street, including 3 sets of brothers. This is one of the brothers. His name was Gerard Hughes. He tried to sign up when he was only about 17 years old. But he said, if you can, I know you can't read that, but if you could, you'd see he said he was 19 and a half. He said he was working as, I think, a railway servant. And he got quite a bit of the way through the process. So he got his whole form filled in. He got assigned to a regiment. But at the very end, and you may just be able to see it, the recruiting sergeant or whoever was working with him through this form says he did not recommend him for the army. Now, we don't know why, but it's quite likely he copped that this is a young lad, and he was sent home a few days later. His neighbour across the road, who was exactly the same age, and they went to enlist on the same month. That's the wrong, I'm going to go back, wrong picture. He went to enlist, he was about 16 or 17. He wasn't spotted. He was sent off to fight, and he spent about a year in Flanders before he was grievously wounded, and he was sent home permanently and totally disabled. And so I often think about that little street at that time and what those 2 sets of parents must have felt, with one lad coming home safe and sound after a few days, and the next boy permanently and totally disabled. And of course, there was many sad stories like that, and I have to say we found this whole project quite poignant and emotional, learning a little bit about the young lads, on census night when they were only kids, and then several years later their experiences in the war. Most of the soldiers served with the 36th Ulster Division, which was a division that was formed, in East Belfast at that time. That was the Irish Fusiliers, the Irish Rifle, and the Royal Fusiliers. The vast majority were with those. Most of them served in France and Flanders. Many of them served at the Somme. Now, some served in other battlefields in Gallipoli and Macedonia and in North Africa. And quite often, as you may know, like when a soldier may have been signed up with one regiment, but as that regiment progressed in the war, maybe it was disbanded or you joined up with a different regiment, so they moved around quite a bit. But we do know most were in France and Flanders during the war. Mostly they served at the level of private, and they seemed, most of them, to stay at that for the duration of the war. This young man actually became a sergeant. His name was George King, and he was he was one of 4 brothers, but he's the only one we know for sure served. He made it to the rank of sergeant. He served in France. He served for several years before being killed in France at the age of 22. And altogether, 18 of our soldiers died, many of them at the Somme. We we got quite attached to our soldiers that we were researching. And one of the members of the team actually went to France last year on holidays, and they went to visit the commemorative sites and the graves, and went around exploring and found the commemorative stones of quite a lot of the soldiers who we had researched who had died, and some individual graves. And this is the grave of a young soldier who went off. He served for a couple of years before just about 1 year before being killed at the age of 19. And that's his grave. And it's nice to see, at any rate, that it's looked after and well kept there in France. Altogether, as I said, 18 of our soldiers died. That left 56 who came home to Belfast. 23 of those were wounded, and some of them were very seriously wounded. As I mentioned, a couple of examples. But there were others who lost limbs, who had lost eyesight, who were significantly impaired, and not to mention all the PTSD that they would have experienced as well. They came back, of course, to a city that was very different from the city they had left. Most of them had gone off in 1914, 1915. Obviously, things were percolating at that point, and issues were becoming to a head. And the kind of things that were just beginning to percolate, as I say, at that time, were now at boiling point. They didn't come home for the most part. The ones who survived the whole war and didn't get discharged till after the war didn't get home till about 1919. So even though the war ended in 1918, they weren't discharged until the treaties were all signed or well underway, and so on. And they were stationed in England for many months until then they got home. So they were arriving back in Belfast throughout 1919 in absolutely the thick of things, and finding a city that was very changed, including a city that was very changed in respect of the Irish language, which now was becoming more associated with a particular identity. But interestingly, and I think they were coming home to a city where the war itself was becoming to be understood in terms of identity. So some of them could come home and embrace the Irish language if they wanted. Some could come home and embrace their participation in the war as a crucial part of their identity. But they could really probably not do both at that point in time. And if we just look, there's just a few soldiers that we have some information on their lives after the war, and it just gives us maybe a hint of what they came back to. And this is Edward Armstrong. He was one of the oldest soldiers that we found. Most of our soldiers were very, very young when they went off to join up, and some of them, as you saw, were actually well underage. This man was a married man with 3 children. He lived on Hatton Drive. He was a printer by trade. He served in the war. He was wounded. He had some hearing loss and a wound to his foot. But because he was a printer, those kind of wounds weren't too significant. So he came back, went back to his home and family, picked up his trade again, and continued working for many years after the war. So he was able to pick up the threads of his life. That was quite unusual. This man is Bernard Hughes. This is the brother of Gerard Hughes, who tried to enlist when he was only 17 and got sent off. He came back home. He served the full course during the war. He came back home, didn't seem to be able to settle as well. And he wrote, if you can see that letter there, he wrote to the War Office asking them for copies of his discharge papers, because he said his had been destroyed in the Belfast riots. And he wanted to emigrate to Canada. Now, we don't know if he went to Canada, but we do know a year later he wrote again to the War Office. And that time he said he also wanted copies of his discharge papers again, because they'd been lost in the war, and this time he said he couldn't work because of the impairments he suffered during the war. So he doesn't seem to have fared so well. This man is a man called, and his name, what can I Sorry? Highland, thank you. This soldier, he was an Irish speaker during the war. He was from Thorndike Street. He was a commercial traveller. And he went off, he joined the army quite young. He served during the war. He was promoted during the war. He was very, very badly injured, but he survived. and he went on to become a career soldier. He ended up as a captain in the Indian Army, which was, of course, the British Army in India. So that was the route he took after the war. He just stayed soldiering and went on and became a captain. And this, our final soldier, we don't have a picture, unfortunately, but what we do have is his sign-up papers. This is a soldier called Hugh McGowan. He was from the Short Strand in Belfast. He was an Irish speaker. He signed up. He served for the duration of the war. He was discharged at the end of the war. He signed up again, joined the Yorkshire Rifles, and 6 months later, he left the Yorkshire Rifles. We don't know why, but what we do know is a couple of years later, he turns up in the newly formed Free State Army in the training camp in the Curragh. So I think when you just look at those paths after the war, it gives you some idea of the journeys that they were taking and the way, they were, I suppose, making sense of their lives in the Belfast that they came back to. So I know I've rushed through that, but I'm happy to answer any questions. We have a website where you'll find more information and where you can contact us if you want, and we're very open to people contacting us and telling us anything they might know or correcting anything we might have got wrong, and you'll find that's the website address there. So thank you.
Hello everyone. I am going to be really brave tonight and talk about what do PUL communities talk about. So I am the Heritage Officer with EastSide Partnership. It's a regeneration charity in East Belfast. I've been doing heritage there for 4 years, using heritage as a way to engage people with their place and increase civic pride and build a sense of community. So I'm going to ask you a quick question. What do you think, in terms of identity, what do you think East Belfast Protestants will talk about? Any suggestions?
Tour?
Yes, that has come up frequently. The big hitters are like usually the shipyard, Titanic. Like sometimes you get Orange Order, the bands, like flags. None of that has come up in my work in the last 4 years, unless I've specifically sought it out. Do some nice work with Glentoran, and I have to say, brilliant people to work with. And we have done some work with, like, say, the Orange Museum and things like that. But I think those things haven't come up because we take a slightly different approach. I take an approach that's place-led and not culture-led. So when I work with people to discover their heritage, I'll ask them about their place, about where they're from, and what are their stories that they have to tell about that place. I think storytelling is so important because if you're going to choose to tell a story, you've selected that from all of the things in your mind, so it has value. You've chosen to tell it to somebody else, so you want to share it. So I think so much part of our identity is like wrapped up in the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, and the stories that we tell each other about who we are. And that is really the basis of my work, that's wrapped up in like the box of East Belfast, I guess. It's all about what stories are we selecting and how are we going to tell those to other people. I'm going to fire through these next couple of slides because they're probably going to be kind of boring for most people, but I just wanted to talk about when I'm working with groups, I'm not going in with a thing that I'm going to work with them. I don't come to them and say, we're going to do a project about the shipyard, or we're going to do a project about the rope works, or we're going industry's big, everyone loves talking about industry, or we're going to do a project about about this building or whatever. Generally, as much as I can get away with it with my funders, because funders always like to have things tied up in a little neat bow. That's right, isn't it, Paul? Yeah. I will come to my group and say, tell me what you want to work on. What is there that you want to tell people about who you are and where you're from? So you can see this little problem-solving model here that we use quite frequently, and it's about identifying an issue. So some of the issues that we've come up about are, nobody knows about our neighbourhood, so let's tell them about our little neighbourhood of Bloomfield or Strandtown or Craigie, or maybe it's, oh, we were doing this project, but there's no women involved. Can we put more women's stories in it? So we've identified the issue, and then we explore it. So I work with the group to figure out how we can do that. So we do a little bit of research skills. So we'll go over to Prony, we'll go to the Central Library, and like learn how to use the archives and the resources there. And we'll look and see what other people have done with similar projects too. And then we're going to decide what we're going to do with all that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our projects later, but they've all had some like different outputs. So some people want to make an exhibition, or some people want to make a heritage trail. Other people are happy just to spend time talking together. And then at the end of it, we have a bit of a celebration, a bit of a launch, and make sure that all of those things get out into the public domain. Now, I just want to fire this wee slide in quickly and say that it's asset-based community development approach that we're using here. And there's a little phrase that's used in asset-based community development is start with what's strong, not with what's wrong, which is what I love. So it's like asking people those questions like, what do you love about your place that you want to share with other people? Like, what's special about your street? What's special about your neighbourhood that you think everybody should know? And as you can see there too, it's really relationship orientated. So I spend a lot of time with the groups. Like our shortest projects would be around 3-4 months, kind of going up to about a year. And we really develop good relationships with me and the participants, and also the participants with each other. And it is really inclusion focused there too. So we are looking to put all of those stories in that haven't been told before. So many people are doing great work around, like say Orange history or like peace tourism, things like that. All of those are being done by people already. So we're trying to fill the gaps a little bit as well. And this is where I claim that I am definitely not the expert with this wee slide here. So what I'm really trying to do is get all of my participants to a place where it's done by us, for us. So we'll start on a project and work together for a while. And I'm going to feel really like I've done a good job if after a while they just want to go and do it by themselves without me. So that is, I am trying to make myself redundant in my job. Just trying to work a way to, get people confident enough to tell their own stories without that extra little bit of support. So I'm going to give you some examples of some of the work that we've done over the last few years, and hope to share some of the stories that have come out of it that I found quite fun. So this is my longest term project that I've worked on. It was called EastSide Lives, and it was funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it lasted for about a year. And I had 17 participants on it. Now, I managed to keep 14 of them to the end, which I think is pretty good going for a whole year. So some people will just drift off through the process. We met every couple of weeks. So that's a big commitment for people. Not everyone's circumstances can change during that time. And we had a real capacity building focus on this project. So that was all like, we're kind of going back to that little problem solving model is what do you need to tell your story? So we did lots of conversation work around that, saying, I want to write something, but I don't think that my writing is the right style of writing, or it's not good enough. So then we would get someone in to come and do training for us, or somebody else would say, well, my auntie's hairdresser has really good stories and I want to record them, but I don't know what questions to ask. So we got somebody in to come and do some oral history training with us. So then the group are collecting all of these skills to be able to gather their own stories. So I am going to talk a little bit about some of the stories that came out of it, because I think they are super fun. And they do tell a little bit about the identity and the character of the people of East Belfast. And I'm going to start with the picture that we've got here. And that is Wendy on the left. I actually feel quite guilty telling their stories for them. They're very, very capable of telling these themselves. But Wendy on the left, she is standing in front of her research that she did for EastSide Lives. So each person that was involved researched a character from the past, and we worked with an artist who designed street art representing these people from the past, and then they wrote a little bit about them and put it up on an interpretive panel beside them. So Wendy chose her grandmother, who was a really interesting woman. She lived on the Newton Arch Road during the Second World War, and she worked for, her name was Mary Rodey, but everyone locally called her Mrs. Melville, and Melville's was the funeral parlour on the road at the time, and she worked in the funeral parlour. And she just didn't only work in the funeral parlour. She kind of set up an unofficial citizens advice shop, and when people would come in to like arrange a funeral, she would talk, especially to the women, about any money they might have got from like their wee co-op insurance policy and things, and like ask, how are you going to invest this? Like, are you going to be okay? And she kind of set up this like unofficial like advice support system for people, and she was just really loved in that role. And Wendy tells a story about how, even though it was a funeral home, it was always a place that was absolutely full of joy and music and happiness, and she remembers the piano being played upstairs above the funeral parlour. And so those were the kind of stories that we were bringing out around ordinary people, but it tells you something about the essence of East Belfast, about the resilience, and about the kindness that people have as well. Jerry, as part of he's on the right, he participated as well, and he told a story about researched a story about his wife's uncle, who was a shopkeeper, again during the Second World War, and he did a mean line and smuggled Free State bread into East Belfast. Nobody cared where the bread was coming from as long as they could get it. But he was really entrepreneurial, and him and his son set up a business where they rented out washing machines on a Monday so that people could do their washing at home and not have to do it by hand. And they would have bunged a washing machine into the back of their van and driven it around to people's houses and like rented it to them for a couple of pence. It's an excellent idea, isn't it? So again, it's telling a little bit about the identity of the area, that it's a place that's full of entrepreneurship and resilience again. Another story that I loved, and I think because it was quite complex in a way, so not everybody that we researched was a hero, and it was this story of Clark Groves. Now, I don't know if there's any football fans here that maybe have heard of Clark Groves, but there's a summer cup that bears his name, and he sponsored that cup back in the day, and he was a bookmaker and a moneylender. Now, there's not very many good-natured bookmakers and moneylenders. They're always out for their pound of flesh, and he lobbied for the legalisation of bookmaking and gambling in Northern Ireland. But what was really interesting about him was, through the research, it was his grandson-in-law that did the research of it. He discovered he was a really complex character, and that he would never ask for money back when people were in trouble. There was a kindness to him, and he always saw people right if they needed money. And it just sort of dispelled those myths of who we think people are. This was someone who had many facets to his character. And the story went that when he died, he was buried at Dundonald Cemetery, which is about 3 miles away from the Newton Arch Road. And the funeral cortege lined the whole of the 3-mile journey to the cemetery because he was so well thought of locally. So those were the kind of stories that we found out during Eastside Lives. If there's time later on, ask me about the Titanic story, because I didn't want to talk about Titanic story because I said we weren't going to talk about Titanic stories. But there is a brilliant one later that we'll get to if we've got time. Now, this was quite a long project. But after that, this group, they finished bang on when the pandemic started, and they were they were at a loss of what to do. A lot of people lived on their own and were feeling lonely, so we decided, well, we'll try and keep working through the pandemic and meet up online if we can. And we were asked by the Ulster Museum to tell a story about East Belfast, and it was originally going to be around industry. The industrial heritage of East Belfast is so powerful. But when the group kind of got together and discussed it, they decided that the only thing they could really talk about or think about at the time was lockdown and the pandemic. If you can remember back those 2.5, 3 years, it was just all encompassing at the time. So we did a project there where we did some contemporary collecting, which was like gathering objects that tell the story of what's happening. So it's still on in the Ulster Museum. So there is a beautiful glass case filled with toilet rolls and hand sanitizer, because if you remember like the riots over buying toilet rolls. So it's just collecting those little stories of what's happening at the time. It was a really interesting process to be a part of too, because although it wasn't necessarily about identity per se, it was the suggestion that because you're from East Belfast you'll want to do industrial heritage. We were able to subvert that through the process a wee bit and just show that it's a wider kind of form of identity and placemaking. Because I don't have money to work with people for a whole year at a time, all the time, I was able to run these little shorter programs, which were about 3 or 4 months each. This was the Connections program, and we run those on a neighbourhood basis. So we ran them in Craigie and Bloomfield and Strandtown. Now this picture here is from Strandtown, which makes it look very popular because there's lots of people sitting in the Strand Arts Centre there at a talk. But that was because we invited Aidan Campbell along, who some of you might know some of his work. He does lovely picture books with reminiscences in them. So he came along to do a talk, and we opened that up to the wider community. And that was part of the project of exploring Strandtown. So the idea for that was we would invite some experts in and do some workshops, and then there was a lot of space for the participants to bring their own stories and their own reminiscences about that, and then to create something at the end of it. And this is where my idea of that I'm in charge got completely turned on its head, because remember that little picture of like the green and they're doing it by themselves? I was booted out totally in this project, in that they decided that they wanted to do a timeline as their output from it. And I was like, oh no, I hate timelines, it's really awful. But then somebody suggested they do this lovely idea of interweaving their own personal stories with the timeline, with like the wider history. So they picked up some, like big things that had happened, like the St. Mark's Dundela is the big famous church where C.S. Lewis's grandfather had lived and worked, and put that in, and the erection of of Samson and Goliath, the big cranes which overlook the area. And interwoven into all of these was the time that somebody's grandfather got a job as a messenger boy, or somebody else's grandfather was playing hockey with the Strandtown 11s. And it was just lovely storytelling about how people and place belong together and are woven together. We do some short-term engagement as well. Do have a wee look on our website, visit Eastside. If you fancy coming to kind of hear some talks and tours, I will promise I will not try and rope you into a year-long project unless you really want to. But part of this is around identity building too. This is what a lot of that project work turns into at the end. It often turns into a trail, or Jerry that we saw as in the picture back with Wendy and the street art, he trained as a tour guide after the project, so he's now out telling those stories on these trails and making them public. So a lot of our short-term engagement is around taking those stories and sharing them with as wide an audience as we can, and really trying to show the best side of East Belfast and who the people are, and all of their best attributes, and trying to uncover some of those stories that we haven't told as well, because I think some people just haven't even had a chance to say publicly who they are or what their identity is, and it's all still a work in progress. So that is me. If anyone wants to get in touch, do please drop me an email, and I'll be always happy to talk. We are doing some story gathering work around Templemore Baths, so if anyone learned to swim there or has any memories, we'd always love to hear those as well. So thank you.
We've just come through what has been known as this decade of centenaries. Do you find, as a group, has that decade of centenaries helped break down some of the misunderstandings about what has happened in the last 100 odd years or has it not?
I personally found it helpful, and I have to say, back in, it must have been 2015, when you saw it coming, my feeling was, oh no, it's going to cause a lot of issues and muddy the waters. But in fact, the opposite was true. I think groups wanted to engage then, and there was a lot of open discussion and mature and respectful discussion. I was also very impressed, I have to say, by the way that the Southern government dealt with things, and I watched some of the coverage on television. So no, I found it good. And as I say, my first feelings were, oh, why don't we just ignore all these things coming up,
Yeah, I would agree to a great extent. I do think there was some very positive things, very positive engagement, and I also think though that the fallout from the decade of will take a while. Do you know? I think good seeds were sown during the centenaries, the remembrances.
Yeah, I think it was really useful in showing that we don't need to back away from telling difficult stories, and that we can carry that learning forward into other situations where there are power imbalances still now, involved in several contested heritage projects that are contested all sorts of things, maybe not just like orange and green or political, but around class or gender and politics with a small p. So yeah, I think it's helped give us the skills and the framework to be able to explore harder topics.
Having taught in a secondary school for 35 years, I know I don't look old enough to have taught 35 years, but I can remember well one boy in particular. He was in third form, and the headmaster asked me to bring him down to the office because his father was an inspector of the police in Lurgan, and he'd just been shot about an hour beforehand and murdered by the IRA. And Mr. Russell didn't tell the boy, your father is dead. He said, I'm sorry, your dad has been injured. And I can remember that boy, he must have been about 13 at the time. Do you know what he said? Mr. Russell, can I go home because my mummy will need me? I remember those words. And in fourth form that year, we decided deliberately to teach 20th century Irish history. That was dicey, because it was the time of the Troubles, and it was very controversial, but we wanted to do it. And this boy chose that subject. And I was taking the class. And when I would be teaching the moderation on both sides, I would be looking at Alan, and I would think, he must think it's okay for Miss Hall to teach us that. Her father wasn't murdered by the IRA. And I was always conscious of that boy in my class thinking that. And years later, I met him in town one day, and he saw me, and he shouted my name, and he stopped me. And I said about what had worried me. He said, Miss Hall, I love that history. And there was me worrying, but he was such a brave boy that he loved history, which showed you discrimination on both sides, and yet he took it on board. And that boy and that attitude to that never left me. It was wonderful. He was so courageous. And we were quite forward in choosing that subject to teach, because I never was taught Irish history in any state primary schools or secondary schools. It wasn't mounted, and that was bad. So that's my lecture.
I think not just a courageous boy, a courageous teacher and a courageous school to take it on too.
Linda, could I ask you, from the start of your journey in East Belfast, did you say 10 years ago? That part of East Belfast is a hinterland of the stronghold of the UDA. Can you tell us what changes you have seen from when you started, when it must have been very difficult in those days, to what it is now?
Okay, well, I'm from that area, and it's a stronghold of both UDA and UVF. And as I say, I'm from Thistle Street, which is on the interface there. I'm actually the third generation of my family that was born in Thistle Street. Over the last lot of years, what I have seen, in many ways I've seen some deterioration. I've seen people getting back into their silos, unfortunately. I've seen suspicion growing again. I mean, just beside where I'm based in Skenos, there's a big sign that says, you know, where I just can't remember the word, something about culture, we'll not allow our culture to be overrun or whatever. And, you know, so those sort of attitudes are, I suppose, from some, they're on the rise again. But on the other side of that, what I have seen within my own work, I talked about, you know, people being frightened of being identified as learning Irish. That's gone. You know, I look at the sheer numbers of people who come to my classes. At the minute, there's only one person that I can think of who would genuinely be frightened of people knowing that he's learning Irish, and he's not from East Belfast, he's from another part of Belfast. So I do see sort of strength in numbers, and where you have this kind of hardline minority, I think you have a bigger number of people who are questioning the situation and who want and desire something better. These are the people that, you know, want to send their children to integrated education, who, you know, are the middle ground voters, let's say the Alliance voters, Green Party or whatever, the soft maybe UUP voters, who are just sickened by it all. And we tend to attract, I think, a lot of those in Turas who are not only interested in Irish language, but they're interested in challenging the status quo. I see it very much in the Nice School, where our parents want something, they just want something better and they want something different. And I know myself with the language, you know, I want a society, I don't want the society that I grew up in. And I mean, most of us will be at a certain age and we know, you know, where things were at. And I think to have a normal society, you have to behave in a normal way. We can't wait for it to be normal. We have to treat it like it's normal, and then it will be normal. And if we feed into the hatred, the suspicion that people did do 30, 40 years ago, then that will keep going. You know, this is not the 1970s or the 1980s. You know, if somebody tries to tell me to hate somebody because they're a different religion, you know, it's just ridiculous. It is madness. And I'm not doing it. And I don't care whether somebody votes Sinn Féin or the DUP, that's their business. And why am I going to get myself worked up about that?
The topic is issues of identity. You give a great talk, Linda, about the language and the passion you have for it for the last 10 years. But the whole issue of the correlation with Irishism, I don't know, does it exist or does it not exist in your world, in your thought process? As in, are you purely, could be French, could be German, could be Irish? Or is it in any way tied up in with the whole identity of the country and the background, and especially with 100 years of Northern Ireland being formed recently?
It's a good question, and I suppose when I got involved with the language, I mean, I had no background in the language, I didn't know people who spoke Irish, and there was a part of me, even though I wouldn't regard myself as a very Protestant, you know, come from a very left-wing family and whatnot, there was a part of me that thought, am I doing something wrong? Is this about identity? Does this language belong to me? I regarded it as Catholic, I regarded it as south of the border, I regarded it of all the things that weren't true, that I had to kind of discover on my journey, and I've seen other people doing that. And I suppose one of the things I recognise is, you know, yes, Irish, we go right back, we go right back where colonisation and all the rest of it, you know, Irish then was banned to a certain extent. You couldn't have Irish names and Irish signs. You come later up, and then 1916 and Padraig Pearse and whatnot associated Irish language and Irish culture with a different identity, so we should be free of English rule. And then our more recent troubles, the kind of Chucky Arla thing. So I can see how Irish has become associated with a particular political outlook. But it wasn't always like that, obviously. And I also don't feel that I should be limited because of what somebody else did or what somebody else thinks. And also, I suppose, for me, as part of my journey, because I didn't know that the language had gone to Scotland, the language had gone to the Isle of Man, And what was originally the same language became sister languages, so Scottish Gaelic and Manx Gaelic. Also, that Irish is part of the family of Celtic languages spoken throughout the British Isles, and at one time a Celtic language was spoken in England, and many of the place names in England are Celtic words. So for me, the language doesn't say to me that we are this wee separate place. It says that we are part of a family of islands and we have familial ties to each other. And I think that's a very important thing, and I think that's what should be promoted. And I think that's bigger, you know, the geographic links that we have, because we are one island, but we're also 13 miles away from that other island. And I think we have to learn, no matter what our history is like, no matter the hurts that we've done to each other, I think we have to learn to live together as a group of islands. And for me, the language is a bridge, and it's a medium of reconciliation.
Linda, can I ask you, has Brexit affected your work?
I suppose it's another one of the protocol, and Brexit is another thing that it's caused hardening of hearts. And I think, you know, if we all think back to the Good Friday Agreement and that period afterwards, there was such a positivity, you know, you felt like anything was possible. And, you know, people were starting to trust each other, barriers were being broken down, and then gradually that started to recede, and unfortunately the whole Brexit and protocol situation has really accelerated that process. And I sometimes feel it's another tool that's going to be used against me, you know, in the work that I do, and another barrier to get over, really. So I'd have to say yes, unfortunately it is. And it just makes me think of a little story. I remember, you know, I mean, I had no background in community work. I had nothing like that when I started in this job. And, you know, 10 years ago when I started working for East Belfast Mission at the Turas project, sometimes I felt like I was taking on the world, you know, because you had these dissenting voices who were saying you shouldn't be doing this, you're wrong, you're a traitor, you're you know, and all the stuff, you know, something happened with the DUP or something, or Sinn Féin did something, and I felt like, you know, whether it was on social media or whatever, I had to kind of counteract that. I was this kind of lone voice, and I was exhausted. And I was sent away for like a weekend kind of community leadership thing, and I didn't want to go because I hadn't time, I was too busy working. And it was the most wonderful thing I ever did, because what it taught me was that all these things are going on. So whether it's Brexit or whether it's the fall of Stormont because of the DUP or because of Sinn Féin or whatever, and they're all happening, I can't ignore them, they're there. But I let them, I acknowledge them, and then I go on about my work, and I keep doing what my work, and I know what my work is about. I know what my agenda is about. No matter who accuses me of anything else, I know what I'm doing. So I acknowledge what else is happening, and I keep going. And so Brexit will come, Brexit will go, other things will happen. There'll always be an issue out there.
Carmel, having looked at the website of your project, it seems that the people behind it, this collaborative effort, is as diverse as what you're looking at in East Belfast. Can you tell us a bit about, you know, the collaborative effort and the different identities that are involved in bringing that project to life?
Yeah, there was about 15 of us during the entire project, about 7 of which was kind of the core group. So I led the project. I'm from Dublin. We had quite a few of the people were local to East Belfast, as I mentioned already, but there were others from other parts of Belfast, from other communities in Belfast. At least one of our people was English, if not 2, at least. And you know, so they were coming. It was very interesting, I suppose. And you know, the question about the decade of centenaries, I think it comes into it too, because the journey that we undertook together, we kind of started off not knowing a terrible lot about, you know, well, what are we going to do? There was a certain amount of capacity building with the project, because the Lottery and the Heritage Fund funds training for community groups. So we did get very good training in how to search the records. The online records, not just the census now, but the military records, and Prony were quite helpful in talking us through their archives and so on. But basically we just came together to see, you know, let's roll this out and see what happens. But one of the things I suppose that did happen was on the journey, as I said, was quite poignant. And what we did, once we had our bunch of soldiers, we kind of divided them up, and we each went off to research individual soldiers, and we would sort of stay in touch with each other through WhatsApp and so on, saying, oh gosh, you know, this is what I found out, and this is what I found out. And I remember the first time somebody found out that their soldier had died, they just put a little message on saying, he died, I'm gutted, you know, and then we were all... So I think the thing that really, that wherever our starting points were and wherever our identities at the start, and I suppose coming from the south where, you know, the war, well, you know, it was classic, don't mention the war, and nobody did for years, you know. It was a very much an eye-opener for me. I think that journey just brought us all to a common place, which was really one of understanding the shared suffering, understanding the shared sacrifice that so many people had made, and perhaps sharing in a kind of a sorrow then that the war and the remembrance of the war became a certain thing perhaps afterwards. Yeah.
First of all, can I express appreciation for all three speakers? Really enjoyed things. I spent most of my life in France and therefore have visited lots of cemeteries, Irish cemeteries, and lots of nationalities, and I think we don't realise how many different countries and nationalities were involved in the wars, and it's so moving, particularly when you see all of these young guys, their names and their ages on the headstones. And because I have lived lots of years in France, I think learning a different language, whatever that language may be, helps us to see our own situation but through a different window. It opens a different perspective. And I think it's sad today that in schools there seems to be so little emphasis on learning languages. Whereas when I was young, you know, we all did languages. Whereas now it seems to me that isn't the case. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I think people should be encouraged always to keep a language, because we live in a global village. You never know where you're going to finish up, and it's always rich being able to read about your own land, but in a different perspective, because you're reading it in a different newspaper or whatever.
Now, this is for you, Linda, and it's just for a smile. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were driving a car around Croatia or somewhere. It was a big roundabout. She nearly drove the wrong way up the roundabout. And in the blinking of an eye, there were two big policemen beside the car. And the first thing he said was, were you drinking? My wife was doing the driving. So one's round talking to my wife, the other one comes round to me, and he says, and I'm going to imitate the language, he said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Ireland. And he said, why are you not speaking Irish? So your fame has spread.
Well, I'll share a quick story with you. I have a friend, and the reason he learnt Irish was his wife had Irish, and he had no interest in Irish, he had no interest in anything, Gaelic games, anything at all. He was on holiday in France, and he said he was totally in the wrong. He got drink in him, and he was making fun of the way a couple of French guys spoke English, and they said to him, hold on, you speak your language? And he said, I am speaking my language. He said, sure, you told us you were Irish. And he said he just felt that size. He felt so embarrassed. He went home and he learned Irish, and he's a fluent speaker now. So there you go.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude, I think it would only be fair to allow Lisa to tell her Titanic story. Otherwise, we'll all be wondering what it was.
Oh yes, well, it's not even it's not my story. It's Jeanette. It is now. Well, it's Jeanette's story. Jeanette was the person who researched this and found it out. And she was one of the participants in the project. So some of you may have heard of a young boy called Samuel Scott. And Samuel Scott was the youngest person to die building the Titanic. But he wasn't. Dun, dun, dun. So Samuel Scott has a grave in City Cemetery that was put up, I think, as part of the Féile about 12 or 13 years ago. And his mother was called Jane Scott, and she had 11 children. and Samuel was the second youngest. The youngest was a boy called George. And on the day when a boy fell off the gantry, it was George that was and George was only 13 and wasn't supposed to be at the shipyard. And the mother switched the names and said it was Samuel on the day. Now, because of that, you got a really we think that Harland O'Neill probably knew what had happened. You got a really tiny amount of compensation, only 16 shillings, which was even young if it had been Samuel, because Samuel was an official apprentice. And George wasn't really supposed to be there. He was just kind of covering for the day. So we reckon they probably knew and just felt sorry for her. So George died, was buried in an unmarked grave. It was unmarked until about 12 years ago. And 12 years ago, people celebrated it as being Samuel's grave. But Samuel was alive up until 1968 and is actually buried in Milltown Cemetery. And so he's the only person, I think, to have 2 graves in Belfast. And Jeanette discovered all of this, and the additional part was his mother, the mother, Jane Scott, felt that she had lost 2 sons that day anyway, because of the cover-up, Samuel went to live in Canada, and she apparently put a curse on the Titanic as it was leaving the dock, and so she is, family legend goes that she is the reason that the Titanic sank. She cursed it as it left Belfast. That's my Titanic story.
Thank you.